soaring with the eagle so high, feeling free. Remember me.
Welcome, everyone. Tahdooahnippah.
You and
I hope everyone is having a good day. My name is Deidre Whiteman. I'm the Director of Research and Education, and we are going to go ahead and get started. And before we start, I'd like to open it up to our one of our NABS staff members, and I'm going to ask him to do a opening prayer and song. And as with anything, I always like to start, things with prayer and good intentions. And so I'm going to ask Marky Bear Eagle, who is an Ogallala Lakota from the Wounded Knee community of Pine Ridge. He graduated from Ogallala Lakota College with a BA in Lakota Studies, and then completed an MA in American Indian Studies at the University of California. And we're so lucky to have him here with us. And so, Marky, I will turn it over to you.
It's good to see you all today. Um, Thank you for the introduction, Hankashi. I guess I'll go ahead and get started with the prayer song here.
And people decide to wear orange. Not only was orange something that was, triggering to her in a time of what she went through as a kid, but it represented the emotional, mental, spiritual, and physical trauma endured during this era. The color orange during this time, going back to school, fall time, changing of the seasons, can also represent healing, and the honoring and the remembering of the children who left and never came home, who were confused with feelings of abandonment and shame and neglect, and who had to endure a lot just to survive. So now, as we come to September 30th, the National Day of Remembrance for boarding school survivors here in America, we want to let you know that we know that every child matters, and that we have a lot of work to do to figure out how this happened and to ensure that it doesn't happen again. Policies like the doctrine of discovery, manifest destiny, were intended to remove us from our homelands, break us down, remove us from our care, leave us lost and forgotten, and having our relatives wondering why no one was coming back home. You can get involved in changing history. NABS is currently pushing House Resolution 7227 and Senate 1723, called the Truth and Healing Commission on Indian Boarding Schools Policies Act. This act is the act. This is how you can get involved. Contact your legislature. You can find an easy toolkit to get you through this on our website. But this Boarding School Policies Act is going to help us figure out exactly what happened. It's going to help us find the documents. It's going to help us talk to the people that experienced it, so we can have those histories recorded forever. It's looking and finding out where the money was going. It's finding out the names of the children who were forced to go. It's the names of the children who were abused, died, or went missing. And it's also looking at the long-term impacts that we know that there were 523 known Indian boarding schools that operate in the United States. It's finding the paperwork. It's looking for those voices in the dust that are going to help us with our healing. So please go to our website. Please go to your local, go to your local event that's happening on September 30th near you. And again, thank you so much for being here and remembering and honoring our boarding school survivors, our ancestors. And thank you for being part of the healing movement with us today. So thank you.
Opida Meg, I really appreciate your words. They're, I know you have a lot invested into the work that we're doing, and as all of us are, because we're all descendants. And so I really appreciate your words and sharing the information with everyone here today. So again, Wopida. And so I would like to introduce now, and before we start, just a few house rules. So we are going to be, we're going to have a Q&A session or a Q&A after the presentation. And so if you can please put your we have a Q&A box here located on the lower part of your screen. If you can keep those questions there, and then I know we have some chat messages going on in the chat box, but if you want to ask a question from the presentation, if you can please wait until the end of the presentation and put it in the Q&A box so that Joe can read off the questions. And if you have any other questions beyond that, please put it in the regular chat box. Like if you're having any issues, please let us know. And so with that, I will get started with Joe. I'm going to introduce Joe, who is our moderator. Joe Tahdooahnippah is an enrolled member of the Comanche Numanu Nation of Oklahoma and joined the NABS team as a research assistant in the spring of 2023. He began his post-secondary education at Haskell and finished his Bachelor of Science degree at the University of Minnesota Twin Cities. And we are so excited to have him here with us. He's actually in Washington, D.C. currently advocating for our bill. And so with that, Joe, please take it over.
Thank you, Deidre. I appreciate that. Good morning, good afternoon, everybody from wherever you're tuning into our presentation today. I'll start with my introduction. Marawik Nananiat Joseph Tahdooahnippah, Minneapolis, Minnesota, Naina Kimara, Nasinumana, Nanat Numana Sa Tahdooahnippah, Dasa Manatachi, Za Na Nasuka Sikataran Oda. So thank you everybody for joining us today. I'll be the moderator. As Deidre had stated previously, everybody will have the opportunity to put questions for our presenter today in the question box. So please, during the presentation, if you have a question you'd like to ask Dr. McBride, just feel free to put it in that question box. And I have the honor of introducing our speaker today. And so Dr. Preston McBride, Comanche by descent, lives and works on the homelands of the Tongva peoples as an assistant professor in the Department of History at Pomona College. Prior to being at Pomona, Dr. McBride earned his PhD in history from the University of California, Los Angeles. Preston has been awarded fellowships and grants for the medical and digital humanities and Native American history at UCLA, the School for Advanced Research, the UC Humanities Research Institute, and Dartmouth College. His research focuses on health, education, and colonialism. His first book project evaluates student health, environmental conditions, and the public policies at Native American boarding schools. In doing so, it uncovers thousands of deaths from hundreds of Native American communities, ranging from Aleuts in Alaska to Abenakis in Maine, and from Kumeyays in San Diego to Seminoles in Florida. He has taught classes on U.S. history, American Indian history, history of medicine, and mass incarceration, consulted for PBS documentaries and a play at the Oregon Shakespeare Festival, co-curated an exhibit on photography, and submitted a joint petition to the United Nations Working Group on Enforced or Involuntary Disappearances. So without further ado, Dr. Preston McBride, the time is now yours.
Thanks, Joe. Give me a second to share my screen. All right. Mariatwe, and then it's Preston McBride. My name is Preston, and I'm excited to be here with all of you today. I'm currently coming to you from the unceded ancestral homelands of the Gabrielino-Tongva peoples in what is now known as Los Angeles, near their village of Tahdooahnippah. And as Joe mentioned, I'm a historian of the United States and Native America at Pomona College. I want to begin by expressing my gratitude to NABS for inviting me to share a bit about my work, and also for their tireless dedication over the past decade for advocating for boarding school survivors and their descendants. And in particular, this talk would be possible without Deidre and Joe. So thank you both. And also thank you all for being here. Before I get into the presentation itself, I just want to warn you that some parts of my talk are quite heavy. And if you need to get up, take a break, say a prayer, please feel free to do so. What the vast majority of the American public knows about Native American boarding schools is typically confined to the large off-reservation boarding schools that began with the Carlisle Indian Industrial School in 1879. That school's prominence in our historical memory, with figures like Richard Henry Pratt, Jim Thorpe, and Pop Warner, covers over the darker history of these institutions. There's no sense of the scale of the system as a whole, nor the destruction that it wrought. There's no sense that the system claimed thousands of lives. Indeed, so many students had died by 1916 that the Indian Affairs Commissioner lamented, quote, "We cannot solve the Indian problem without Indians. We cannot educate their children unless they are kept alive," end quote. So today I'm going to share a little bit about my research about diseases in Indian boarding schools. I'll first talk generally about the boarding school system as a whole. And again, I'm a historian, so I'm going to be focusing on the sources, documents, and highlighting some of their limitations. I'll explain that school superintendents adopted a series of practices that make our understanding of the demographic impact of the schools difficult even today. And then I'll then zoom in on Harris or Sherman as a case study to illustrate how these practices manifested locally on the ground in one, or depending on how you count them, two schools. Ultimately, the thing that I would like to stress today is that the schools were far more lethal than previously known, a topic that has recently garnered more attention because of the investigations in Canada and reparations from schools like Carlisle, Fort Belknap, and others. So I'm assuming that most of you know about boarding schools, so I'll keep this overview brief. They're a key part of the story of the dispossession of Native American lands by the United States as fights over Native American sovereignty shifted from battlefields to the classrooms across the 19th century. Carl Schurz, the United States Secretary of the Interior, and ultimate overseer of the boarding school system, had concluded in 1881 that American Indians had two options, quote, extermination or civilization, that is war or school. Basing his cold calculus in economic and philanthropic terms, Schurz explained, quote, "We are told it costs little less than $1 million to kill an Indian in war. It costs about $150 a year to educate one," end quote. So for over 150 years, federal officials took guardianship of Native American youth from across the country and sent them to boarding schools, sometimes thousands of miles away from their families and communities, to educate them in the rudiments of Anglo civilization. And we know about the attempted destruction of indigenous cultures, languages, traditions, and families. In other words, cultural genocide. But my argument here and elsewhere is that in addition to cultures, indigenous bodies were under attack. The schools were militarized sites of corporal punishment, overcrowding, and forced labor. Parsimonious congressional appropriations made it difficult for superintendents to follow Indian office protocols. Underfunding, which had continued for decades, resulted in predictable problems: substandard housing, insufficient clothing, shortages of bedding, malnutrition, and poor medical care, to name a few. Little sleep, hard labor, physical, sexual, and psychological abuse compounded the effects of underfunding and overcrowding, creating conditions that were an incubator for infections. These factors made students more susceptible to diseases and less able to recover once infected. Frequent and recurring epidemics of infectious diseases swept through school populations. In short, an army of federal bureaucrats ranging from school employees to the Commissioner of Indian Affairs, to Secretaries of the Interior, and to congressmen and senators created an environment in which pathogens, especially those causing diphtheria, influenza, measles, mumps, smallpox, tuberculosis, and typhoid fever thrived. Indeed, sickness was one of the most common experiences shared by all boarding school students. And there's no shortage of revolting quotes from the era, as Scher's quote I just read a little while ago attest. But I'd actually like to kind of highlight one that acknowledged the plight as it was happening. And this comes from William J. McConnell, who is at the time an Indian inspector, but he was also the former governor and senator from Idaho. And he's commenting on the boarding school system as a whole. He's writing this letter from the Blackfeet Reservation, but he had just visited Carlisle from 1901. He says, quote, "It seems as if poor Indian boy and Indian girl has no friend under heaven. They are turned over, sometimes forcibly, to the tender mercies of superintendents, who have no more heart than the Plymouth Rock. On the reservations, the police are sent out to gather in children from their parents and crowd them into unhealthful and loathsome dormitories, where the mortality is such as to make us shudder," end quote. And here you see a map that kind of gets at the scale and scope of the system, as I was mentioning a little while ago. It's just selected, so it's not all of the schools, but you can see how they are constellated across North America. Despite how much we know about the institutions, there's still so much we don't know, including precisely how many schools existed or how many students attended them. I'll note that much of NABS's work has started to clarify some of these questions. Still, the schools remain so understudied that fewer of half of the off-reservation boarding schools have monographs written about them, not to mention the 1,000 on-reservation boarding, day, mission, and contract schools that were, again, constellated across the country. And here what you see is 400. This is an older slide that doesn't have the updated numbers, but essentially one of these boxes stands for a boarding school. And you can see the work that scholars have done so far. Again, it's just a testament to how much work we have to go. One of the keys to truth-telling and understanding boarding schools is the hundreds of millions of records produced by the institutions, most of them housed in the National Archives locations across the country. To give you a sense of the size, the Department of the Interior went through 103 million pages for their 2-volume report, the most recent volume released in July. And there are countless types of records in this collection, including attendance records, circulars, correspondence, ephemera, financial ledgers and account books, official reports, and student files. There's no doubt to its richness, but the sheer scale of the records is an impediment. Quite frankly, it's remarkable that these records exist at all. For decades before their records transfer to the National Archives, the Bureau of Indian Affairs stored records in attics, basements, and closets in various locations around the country, where some of them met their demise to fires, floods, insects, rodents, and water. The schools also disposed of many original documents. Excavating morbidity and mortality records from the boarding school archives is difficult. Records are idiosyncratic. Standards dictated from Washington, D.C. changed over time so that the records of the 1880s look very different than the records of the 1990s, and they present different information. In any given school, an army of clerks and nurses created records with little uniformity. Employees recorded records inconsistently. Names, tribal affiliations, and 19th century medical terminology differed across the records, schools, and times. Hospital records remained sparse. And with the exception of notes between the superintendents and the doctors or the outing matrons, almost no internal correspondence has been saved, making day-to-day operations of the schools opaque. Sometimes the only evidence of a child's existence is a scrap of paper with a hastily scribbled note. And then there's also the issue of accessibility under US privacy laws, which doesn't allow us, for good reason, to see records of the last 75 years. But information that we're able to uncover in boarding school archives help us tell profound stories about human agency, perseverance, resistance, tragedy, and survival against all odds. Nonetheless, these records can help recover, give voice to, and memorialize these children. Still, the sources often raise more questions than they answer. And here you have a brilliant painting by the Cree artist Kent Monkman detailing the horror of the separation of children from their families and communities, often by agents of the state, here the police and religious organizations. We can also use these documents to demonstrate the unreliability of government reports, as archival documents often contradict what was reported by Washington. I find it helpful to start with what we know. The Department of the Interior's second volume of its recent investigation into the schools is one of several historical inquiries into the institutions going back to the 1920s, and depending on how you count again, even before. Each successive investigation has revealed more about the schools. And this particular report updated the total number of known Indian boarding schools, quantified the cost to the government, which was more than $23.3 billion in last year inflation-adjusted dollars, while the federal government ratified 171 treaties with Native nations that had provisions for education while gaining over 1 billion acres of Indian country in exchange. Importantly, the report recognized that, quote, at least 973 American Indian, Alaska Native, and Native Hawaiian children died while attending federal Indian boarding schools between 1819 and 1969. And that, quote, the actual number of children who died while in Indian boarding schools is greater, end quote. So here I've broken down the data in that report by the decade. So it's not the full report, 1819 to 1969. It's just 4 decades, and I do this for comparative purposes. And again, I want to recognize that the Department of Interior conceded that this is certainly an undercount. So while the Department of the Interior accounted for these at least 973 deaths over 150 years, we can demonstrate that more than 1,500 died in just 40 years, between 1880 and 1920, using the department's own publicly available reports. That is the annual reports of the Commissioner of Indian Affairs, ARCIA, seen here. And just for these decades, the Interior report undercounts deaths by over 1,100. I say all of this not to criticize the Interior's report, and I don't fully know its methodology, but I want to emphasize this discrepancy again shows how much more work there is to be done. It is also why a Truth and Healing Commission is so important. The full extent of the system's lethality is unknown. Even this baseline data from the annual reports of the Commissioner of Indian Affairs is an undercount. In exchange for a slice of the $23.3 billion expended on Indian boarding schools, each superintendent had to submit an annual report to the commissioner for distribution to congressmen, senators, and federal bureaucrats in Washington, D.C. Meant for public consumption, these reports were heavily edited and sanitized. And this is of particular importance for our understanding of boarding schools because we rely so heavily on these reports. They're among the most frequently cited sources and their validity largely unquestioned. My point is just the data inside is just not very good or trustworthy, primarily for 2 reasons. First, there's many years for which superintendents fail to report on health. In other words, there's no data. And then second, school superintendents engaged in various strategies to conceal deaths. And in my presentation today, I'll go through 3 of them: underreporting, sending students home sick, and failing to report epidemics. And to illustrate my broader points here, I'm going to focus on 4 of the largest schools that I study in detail: Carlisle in Pennsylvania, Chamoa in Oregon, Haskell in Kansas, and Sherman in Southern California. I promise that this is the last table with numbers. But first, you can see there's a stunning gulf between official reports and institutional records between 1880 and 1920, revealing the cover-up of actual levels of morbidity and mortality. And so the left column has the Department of Interior reports, the middle, the annual reports, and the far right, my work in boarding school archives. And if I was to reconstruct this table by the years, so broken down by Carlisle for all the years it existed, and Chamoa, et cetera, it would show that the superintendents of these 4 schools underreported deaths year after year. And the archives prove that Richard Henry Pratt and other Carlisle superintendents underreported deaths in at least 12 years and failed to report on the topic in another 9. Chemwa superintendents reported 95 fewer deaths than can be proven in the archives. Haskell, 61, and Sherman, 37. Each of these schools also failed to report deaths in many annual reports, varying between 9 for some school and 19 for another. The government's own documents preserved from the era reveal that these 4 schools underreported by a total of at least 256 student deaths in just these 40 years. Overall, Native American boarding school students in these schools were up to 20 times more likely to die than their comparably aged white counterparts in the United States at the time. And I don't know what the situation looked like in all of the other schools, but if I had to bet, they're likely to reveal similar discrepancies between reports and reality. And I want to stress here that these are not just numbers or statistics. Each one is a child with a name, a family, and a community that has been effectively erased by federal bureaucracy. NABS and NARF, the Native American Rights Fund, have documented that some of these families were never notified and that children are still missing. And I want to acknowledge here these amazing women for presenting some of these cases before the United Nations in Geneva, Switzerland a few years ago. Decisions to conceal deaths did not just take place once a year as superintendents had their clerks type up the annual reports. Everyday practices like sending home very sick children contributed to masking the true demographic impact of the schools. And all superintendents did this. For their part, American Indian parents and guardians worried about their sick children and advocated to get them home. Superintendents were happy to oblige, because if a student did not survive, the death would not count against the school. Boarding school students contracted a range of lethal diseases, most of which I mentioned earlier in my talk. And these diseases generally were common in the United States at the time, but at very different rates. The majority of the students sent home sick had some form of tuberculosis, and often slow death. Rarely are those that were sent home sick mentioned in the annual reports, and tracking what came of these students is difficult. But again, the boarding school archives provides a clear, albeit incomplete picture. At Carlisle, Chemawa, Haskell, and Sherman, between 1879 and 1930, superintendents sent nearly 4,000 ill children home, some of them on the verge of death. For each school, this is an average of about 26 students going home a year. And at least 302 of those students died soon after leaving 4 schools. And thousands more went home sick from the hundreds of other boarding schools. Even Sherman, the least deadly of the 4 schools that I study, still sent home between 500 and 700 sick Native children to uncertain fates, while at least 79 others died shortly after being sent home on some sickness from that school. Now I want to pivot and use Sherman and its predecessor school, the Paris Indian School, as a case study to put some of these ideas together and introduce superintendents as delayed, downplayed, or non-existent reporting. So this map is just to situate us geographically. These schools, Paris opened in 1893, and by the turn of the century, that school was dilapidated, and the superintendent, Harwood Hall, who we'll hear a little bit more about in a second, advocated for a new school in Riverside, Sherman Institute. He was eventually granted his wish. That school opened in 1902, and by 1904, all of the students had been transferred from Paris to Riverside. And so for these purposes, I consider them one school, but in reality, they're 2. So under the rules of the Indian Service, superintendents were to report epidemics and student deaths to the Commissioner of Indian Affairs, but that didn't always happen. Today, within view of the Riverside Freeway or State Route 91, teenagers hurry from their dormitories to class. A 6-foot-tall chain link fence separates these Sherman Indian High School students from the Southern California city of Riverside, 50 miles east of Los Angeles. The landscape may be different, and the automobile replaced by the streetcar. But 120 years ago, the same paths guided the students to class. 5.5 miles from Sherman's main campus, located on the lands connected to the Cahuilla, Luiseno, Serrano, and Tongva peoples, sits the school cemetery. Set in semi-arid foothills and now hemmed in by suburban housing, The cemetery was where school administrators buried students who died at Sherman and whose bodies could not be sent home. The graveyard, secured by a metal fence, contains a smattering of headstones and a large black granite monument with 65 names memorializing the children and young adults associated with the school who lost their lives since 1901, including those lying nearby in unmarked graves. This cemetery remains a stark reminder of the lethal history of the Indian School on Magnolia Avenue. In 1903, Sherman was brand new. With students transferring over from Paris, it was overcrowded, and so inadequate was the clothing supply that students went naked. The schools ran out of money, and Superintendent Harwood Hall fired or furloughed 24 school employees, the overwhelming majority of the workforce. Students fell ill with increasing frequency that spring. Simultaneous epidemics of diphtheria and pneumonia struck, and the school's main sewer line ruptured, spewing sewage across campus and town. William Gabriel, an approximately 18-year-old Serrano student from the Morongo Band, died from typhoid fever, a disease commonly spread in human waste, and also from pneumonia, a complication from the fever. Without a proper hospital or doctor, other students lay quarantined in tents as the diphtheria bacterium attached itself to the linings of their respiratory systems. 2 other students died, Nicholas Tortoise, an 11 or 12-year-old from the Santa Rosa Band of Cahuilla Indians, and Ben Ardilla, an 18-year-old Luiseno student from the Pala Reservation. Hall submitted the only documentation of these fatalities, vouchers for their coffins. Their deaths or causes were never announced, and Hall's annual report is mum on health that year. But high officials in Washington, D.C. now began to take notice of deaths under Hall. On October 3rd, 1903, the Commissioner of Indian Affairs, William A. Jones, seen here, wrote to Hall about, quote, the number of deaths, end quote, at the school. Hall, who was a veteran superintendent, previously superintendent of Oglala, Phoenix, and a couple other schools, responded, quote, I have the honor to state that in reality, there were no deaths at the school, end quote. And apparently this was by design. Hall continued, quote, one boy died on the way home from pneumonia and tubercular complication. His death was inevitable, so he was permitted to be moved. Also, one 15-year-old Kumeyaay girl died soon after arriving home from heart trouble. Hall was likely concealing additional deaths because that month, the Commissioner of Indian Affairs determined that 5 students died at the school that year. Jones concluded, quote, the death rate is far in excess of the average non-reservation schools, and there must be some reason for it, end quote. But little changed at the school. It remained overcrowded, and students began falling ill just days after this exchange. Hall then wrote to Jones, quote, to report the fact that we have at this hour 18 cases of a disease similar to smallpox. 2 teachers and a nurse then quit in fear of the ensuing epidemic. And at its reported peak, 42 students had contracted the disease, which turned out to be smallpox, including several who deserted the school fearing for their lives. Hall was late to report this outbreak, sending the dire message to the Indian office days after the first students showed symptoms. Perhaps the doctor could not produce a proper diagnosis, or some other reason delayed Hall. Indian Affairs Commissioner William Jones suggested why, blaming Hall for not vaccinating students when they entered the school, a departmental policy, and thus causing the epidemic. Quote, had the provisions of that circular been complied with, it is probable you would not have had an epidemic of smallpox. Too frequently, superintendents do not pay attention to the directions given in circulars. And from your own statements, you can see very readily the purpose of that circular now, end quote. Still, Hall retained his position. The following year, 1904, was a disaster. A devastating typhoid epidemic struck, infecting at least 42 students and killing at least 7. Successive epidemics like these, diphtheria and pneumonia, followed by smallpox, followed by typhoid fever, compromised student immune systems, making it easier for them to contract other diseases like tuberculosis. This epidemic, the 1904 typhoid fever epidemic, prompted the school to send home at least 4 students, all who had contracted tuberculosis after typhoid fever. Hall largely sidestepped this lethal epidemic in his annual report, downplaying the outbreak. Quote, "The general health of the pupils has been good, although in the fall of the year we were troubled with some sickness," end quote. That was it. None of the deaths nor the students sent home were mentioned in his report. Six years later, Hall's successor, Frank M. Conser, was at the center of an apparently lethal outbreak. In the fall of 1910 and continuing into the spring of 1911, several outbreaks besieged the school, including 150 cases of diphtheria in November, as well as an abnormally high number of seriously sick children in the spring, principally between the months of February and April. But no sources mention any such epidemic. So how do I know one happened? This is what happens when you put tens of thousands of student files for each school together. You begin to see patterns. Student record forms seen here, which detail students' academic performance, attendance on the back, and on the front, you see biographical information, name, tribal affiliation, where the student's from, when they arrived, stuff like that. And these forms reveal something unusual, again, between the months of February and April 1911, when instruction seemingly came to a halt. School employees recorded scores of students, at least 73 as AB, the bottom image, or absent from the classroom. Boarding schools did not just let students be absent, and certainly not this many. So this, to me, was a red flag. This is incredibly odd. And there's also a string of excessive hospitalizations. Excluding the previous fall's diphtheria epidemic, I discovered at least 10 students was labeled as sick or HOSP, meaning in the hospital. And 2 students died during these 3 months. The doctor authorized another 8 students to go home. And over the course of the remaining school year, another 19 students went home, many of them 14 with tubercular conditions. So beyond the number of students absent from classrooms, the number of children admitted to the hospital in just these kind of 3 months, and the staggering number of tubercular infections suggests a serious epidemic. The high number also suggests a highly contagious disease. The severity of the outbreak, considering those who died or sent home sick, also indicates the disease was serious. So I compared these files against known diagnoses in the school at the time. And there was one glaring overlap of a disease that was serious, highly contagious, and confirmed to be in the school at that time. It's typhoid fever. Several student files are key to unlocking the cause of this lost epidemic. The possible index case, or the first case, might have been Robert White, a 21-year-old Yuki student from Northern California's Round Valley Reservation, who contracted typhoid fever on December 6, 1910. Robert remained in the hospital through April of 1911, when officials returned him to Round Valley because he was too ill to continue with his enrollment. There's no other evidence of diagnosed cases of the disease until February 1911. And then on the 13th of February, Superintendent Conser informed Oregon's Klamath Agency Superintendent Edson Watson that Horace Hill, a 19-year-old Klamath student who had been at Sherman since 1909, had recently been admitted to the hospital with typhoid fever. And the following month, on March 15th, Conser wrote to Paiute student George Lawrence's reservation superintendent, John R. Cox, at the Moapah River Indian Reservation in Nevada, explaining that the 15-year-old was ill with typhoid fever. So these were the 3 confirmed and diagnosed cases of typhoid fever, proving that the disease was present at Sherman in the months, the suspected unknown epidemic, again, February, March, and April of 1911. Fortunately, Robert survived his infection. While the superintendent did not deem George Lawrence's case serious at the time, he acknowledged that typhoid fever, quote, is of course a disease that is always dangerous, end quote. But George's case caused the doctor some concern. However, George reportedly improved 4 days later, or so Sherman administrators thought. As often happened, boarding school students would recover from an initial primary infection, only for dangerous complications or a secondary disease to arise. And the most common complication at Sherman and other boarding schools was tuberculosis, as the tubercular bacillus can more readily infect immunocompromised bodies or transition to its active acute state for those who already had it. On April 14th, Dr. Robley diagnosed George with tubercular peritonitis, an often deadly disease associated with disease-weakened individuals and marked by low-grade fever, night sweats, weight loss, malaise, and fluid in the abdominal cavity. Sherman's superintendent conceded that tubercular peritonitis, quote, is probably more serious than the typhoid fever, end quote. Ultimately, the doctor, quote, did not hold out very strong hope of George's recovery, and the superintendent added, I do not believe that George will ever be in the condition to be sent home. George died at the school 5 days later on April 27th. Meanwhile, Klamath student Horace Hill's typhoid also developed into tuberculosis, and officials sent him home in May 1911. He died at his home in Chiloquin, Oregon, sometime between August and October. Strengthening the possibility that this previously unreported epidemic was typhoid, the disease assailed the school again between August and December of 1911, and again in May of 1912, sickening of at least 6 students. So essentially there's 3 clusters of this disease throughout the school year. And in total, of the 465 students attending the school, upwards of 92 cases, or nearly 20%, would have contracted typhoid fever sometime between December 1910 and June 1912. At least 10 students died there, 3 diagnosed with the disease, and 6 with diseases linked to typhoid fever. But the annual reports only count 8 of these deaths, ignoring 2. So here you have an example of superintendents underreporting deaths. Nor do the reports mention the 14 others who died shortly after leaving the school. Including those who were sent home and died, Sherman's death rate in these 2 academic years was 19.35 and 31.25 per 1,000 students. To give you a sense of the magnitude of these numbers, the death rate for school-age children in the United States at this time was under 5 per 1,000. So a Sherman student was essentially more than 6 times more likely to die. And it's also significant because at this point in time, typhoid fever was becoming less common in the United States as sanitation and our understanding of diseases was getting better. But boarding schools lagged behind. This epidemic highlights the problems with relying on public reports and ordinary school correspondence. Records may have been lost or destroyed, but more likely, officials never reported this epidemic. Superintendent Conser knew the rules as he was the former chief clerk in the Office of Indian Affairs' main Washington, D.C. office. Nonetheless, school employees had incentives to conceal outbreaks. For one, and most obviously, superintendents wanted to keep their jobs and advance their careers, and providing evidence of their failure to combat diseases could have resulted in termination, notably when their decisions directly contributed to the outbreak, as was the case in Hall's 1903 smallpox epidemic. It's also important to note here that health was becoming a much bigger concern to the Indian Office after approximately 1909. But no commissioner of Indian Affairs ever dismissed any Sherman superintendent or any other superintendent throughout the Indian Service that I'm aware of for poor health outcomes, though they probably should have. Other employees at the school may have feared termination for insubordination and going around superintendents, so they seldomly reported to the Commissioner of Indian Affairs, the ultimate, again, overseer of these institutions. And what you see on the screen here is just a word cloud of the transcribed letters from Sherman. You can see some of the big the frequency of some words, so tuberculosis, measles, home, sending students home, hospital, tubercular, nurse. You get a sense of what was going on. Okay, so this is my last table, but there's no numbers on this one. The high rates of tuberculosis in boarding schools was directly correlated to the high incidence of other lethal diseases. It's no different for Sherman. Repeated epidemics lessened students' ability to fight severe illnesses once they contracted a disease. And the more serious disease a student had, the more likely they were to be diagnosed with tuberculosis. Many students suffered the ravages of comorbidities, exacerbated by dismal school conditions. From 1909 to 1930, there were at least 30 epidemics of life-threatening diseases at Sherman, several overlapping, to say nothing of the thousands of cases of colds, aches, pains, and other non-lethal diseases. And so this table shows about 20 of the outbreaks. Typically, after serious epidemics, like the number of deaths, students diagnosed with tuberculosis rose, as did the number of students who were sent home sick. And expectedly, the boarding school archives bear this out. Dr. Robley diagnosed 38 students with tuberculosis in the year after the 1911 epidemic, while he sent a total of 48 students home sick. Remember, on average, the number was about 20, so more than, well, almost 2.5 times the amount of students went home sick that year. One of these students was Nathaniel Reed from Laguna Pueblo, who left Sherman on October 30th, 1911, for a nearly 700-mile journey back to his home village in northwestern New Mexico. Dr. Robley, the school's doctor, had placed Nathan under special observation and often used diagnostic approach for suspicious tubercular cases, and basically it was laying in a hospital bed for a while. Likely scared, the 19-year-old student ran away from the hospital. Sherman officials apprehended and detained him, and according to his sister, then incarcerated the student who was presumptive to have tuberculosis in the school jail and deprived him of food. Also, according to his sister, Mrs. Martin Luther, Nathan escaped to get word of his illness to his family because the school did not allow sick students to write home. And this was generally the case, as students would write monthly letters home to their families in English class. And if a student was sick in the hospital and absent from class, no letter went home. And this is the primary mechanism in which Indigenous families are cued into something is wrong with their child. The school rarely reports hospitalization, but they'll notice that their communication with their child has been interrupted. In addition to kind of rumor mills, students going home, other community members and kin relaying information back home. So following Nathan's recapture, Robley diagnosed Nathan with tuberculosis in both lungs and recommended that he be sent home. Superintendent Conser sent letters to Nathan's sister and reservation agent, a copy of which you can find in the archives. But the letters never arrived, as Nathan's return surprised them both. Laguna's agent recalled, quote, "Nathan arrived unattended on a cold day and had 6 miles to travel to reach his home," end quote. With a nighttime low temperature of 28 degrees Fahrenheit on November 1st, the young man, undoubtedly weakened by his tuberculosis, was completely abandoned and unprepared for the long walk from the train depot. When he arrived home, his family was distraught over his condition. Nathan's father, Fernando Reed, reportedly lamented that, quote, "When they took the boy away, they promised he should have the best possible care, and that they deceived and lied to me," end quote. Henceforth, Nathan's sister insisted, quote, "No white man shall darken his door," end quote. Nathan's case indicates a breakdown of communication and neglect of students in federal custody. Did Nathan Reed die at home from tuberculosis? Extant records do not provide a definitive answer, but probably. He doesn't appear in the 1920 Laguna census. And agents, superintendents, and Indigenous families witnessed firsthand how devastating tuberculosis could be. Many students left home healthy, only to return from boarding schools as emaciated skeletons of their former selves. When Sherman officials determined that Homer, a 12-year-old Hopi student from Jotavilla, Arizona on the Third Mesa, had tuberculosis, school officials informed his superintendent, Edgar K. Miller. But Homer's parents already knew. They had resisted sending Homer to Sherman in the first place because he had the disease. But officials took him nevertheless, again against departmental policy, jeopardizing both Homer's health and that of the students around him. His parents wanted him home, maintaining, quote, "No TB has ever been cured by a white man," end quote. Their other daughter had died from the disease at the Phoenix Indian School in Arizona. Miller acquiesced, quote, "If he had TB, better send him home when he is in good shape rather than when he is near death. It helps the school work and satisfies the parents," end quote. So Robley sent Homer home. Remarkably, Homer survived and had a long career as a timber marking foreman in the Coconino National Forest before passing away in 2004 at the age of 88. His life is a reminder that while tuberculosis could be a death sentence, it did not have to be. So between 1893 and 1930, diseases at Sherman Institute claimed many lives, a solemn fact Indigenous families and communities knew too well. Viola Martinez, an Owen Valley Paiute student who arrived at Sherman in 1927 from the Benton Paiute Reservation, recalled that she witnessed, quote, a lot of sickness. It seemed to me there were always real sick children in the hospital, end quote. Martinez recounted how Paiutes feared Sherman. Quote, I used to hear Indian people say that a lot of children from Sherman came back dead, end quote. Not just hearsay or rumors, she had her own involvement with the matter, recollecting, quote, in fact, the one time that I did go home, I escorted my cousin who died from tuberculosis in a casket to the reservation, end quote. As these cases show, superintendents fail to report epidemics and underreported deaths while sending scores of terminally ill children home. All of these practices are responsible for gaps in our knowledge around issues of health in boarding schools that we've inherited today. But the cover-up goes beyond superintendents. In 1922, the Commissioner of Indian Affairs, Charles H. Burke, hired Florence Patterson, a Red Cross nurse, to investigate the boarding schools. She witnessed, quote, marked symptoms of malnutrition caused by faulty diet, including too little food, the wrong kinds of food, and bad food habits, end quote. She noted that exhaustion then compounded the collective impacts of students' confinement. Quote, there seemed to be indications of the exacting program of the boarding schools frequently facilitated rather than prevented the development of tuberculosis, end quote. Instead of engaging with the report, Burke buried Patterson's remarks before commissioning his own response. Dr. R.E.L. Newbern, the Indian Services medical director and respondent, proclaimed, quote, while it is important for the Indian Office to know of what disease an Indian died, it is of greater importance to know that he is dead, end quote. It was not until 1928 that Patterson's report came to light. In that year, the Secretary of the Interior commissioned the Institute for Government Research, otherwise known as the Brookings Institute, to put the Office of Indian Affairs under the microscope. By that November, survey members had spent 7 months in the field in over 95 jurisdictions. The American Indian Institute president, Yale graduate, Ho-Chunk citizen, and the first Native American superintendent of a boarding school, Henry Rocloud, helped author the report. And we know it today as the Miriam Report. While Sherman remains open today, it and boarding schools like it have gone through several eras of reform over the 20th century, arguably the first precipitated by the Miriam Report. And the schools did eventually change, and it was Indigenous advocacy around health and self-determination that ultimately forced these reforms. So to conclude, without the full range of sources and student case files, our understandings of what happened in boarding schools are limited. Only by closely scrutinizing the entire corpus of extant student files do we begin to understand more fully the harrowing 1911 outbreak, its severity, and its toll on human life, among others. Without these sources, we perpetuate the erasure of these students' lives. The results also call into question the lethality at hundreds of other boarding schools, day schools, mission schools, and contract schools for Native Americans in the United States. Sherman, or for that matter, Carlisle, Chemawa, and Haskell, were not uniquely lethal. United States Indian education policy, officially framed as benevolent and federal custody, killed many Native American children and young adults, leaving shattered families and communities in their wake. Despite its deadly outcomes, the federal government expanded the lethal education system. Indian student deaths in federal custody were considered acceptable collateral damage for the government's larger push to eradicate Native American cultures and life ways. These students were casualties in the making of the modern United States. By burying and concealing evidence in the form of underreporting deaths, sending students home sick, and hiding outbreaks, superintendents and the Indian Office delayed much needed reforms to the boarding school system. Though eventual reforms did not end the boarding schools, nor mortalities in them, they meaningfully changed the institutions. Revealing this mortality makes legible children and young men and women's lives erased by unscrupulous bureaucrats. Oda, thank you, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you so much for your presentation for us today. I will go to our Q&A box and see what we have for questions right now. So we have one of our first questions from a guest is about, do you know about any groups, American-based groups, that are utilizing ground penetrating radar to search the grounds on request for some of these possible unmarked burial sites?
Yeah, I hope she won't throw me under the I hope she won't mind me throwing under a bus, but one of the women I showed in the picture of NABS staff and others presenting at the UN headquarters in Geneva is Marcia Small, Northern Cheyenne woman, who's doing exactly that. And she's the only one that I'm aware of.
Thank you. Next, we have somebody asked, they wanted to know, in your opinion, do you think there will ever be any sort of financial compensation for survivors or descendants of the U.S. Indian boarding school system, similar to Canada?
That's a question that is above my pay grade, and really needs to be answered by the communities and descendants themselves, and kind of consultation with the government. And that looked like a negotiated settlement in Canada. I'm hopeful that once a Truth and Reconciliation Commission comes out, or Truth and Healing Commission comes out and documents more about the schools, that will be one of the logical recommendations that a report like that would make.
Thank you. Our next question. This guest is wondering if there are any records of children who ran away and what sort of punishments they may have received for running away.
This is a really great question. And yeah, the answer is, quite frankly, a significant portion of students ran away. At Sherman, fully 1/3 of all of the students who ever attended the school ran away, and a lot of them multiple times. I mean, there are tens of thousands of desertions, and the punishments varied. This is one of the instances where we really see the coordination with the Indian Service and local police departments or law enforcement agencies. Carlisle and Sherman, basically Pratt and Concert, other superintendents, Piers and Haskell, they were all really well informed about police chiefs and would send telegrams to police chiefs basically on the route for the student going home. And they'd say, Indian student from our school, 5'9", dark complexion, wearing blue overalls, left. And oftentimes they were arrested. They were sent to county jails. A couple of them died in jails. One student who deserted died in San Quentin in California. And they were eventually returned in handcuffs to face discipline at the schools. Sometimes that meant deprivation of privileges, like I mentioned in Nathan's case from running away from the hospital. Sherman in 1911, he was restricted to basically a diet of bread and water. Other students would sit in jail. Students would be beaten. They wouldn't be able to have privileges that other students had. And so those are some of the punishments. Eventually, some students, if they were chronic runaways, would just be expelled.
Thank you. Our next question, in your research experience, do you know how frequent or how often, or if at all, schools kept records on student pregnancies or deliveries?
Yeah. Number one, schools very frequently tracked young girls and women's menstruation cycles, and the absence of their cycles to medical historians is a signal of malnutrition or some other common occurrence. And pregnancies did happen. Some of these pregnancies were consensual, some of them not. Paris's first superintendent, for instance, in 1895, a man named H.M. Savage raped a young Comanche girl. She wound up having that child. He wound up absconding to Mexico, and he also embezzled a ton of money from the school and died somewhere in Mexico, never kind of receiving punishment for his crimes. Oftentimes, two students who gave birth would be expelled and forced to marry and then go home to some reservation home. But the short answer of the question is yes, schools did track pregnancies, they did happen, and there are records about them.
Okay. Next question. Can you further detail some of the living conditions that led to high rates of disease transfer among the children population in the boarding school environment?
Yeah, this is a really great question. And there's lots of mechanisms that produce diseases. Most of them come back to issues of money. So the boarding schools received essentially the same amount of money per capita, per student, over a long period of time, despite prices going up 50 to 100% during that time period. And so basically superintendents could do less with the money that they got. Also, to put this in perspective, other institutions, similar institutions, orphanages, state-run mental institutions, would typically receive about 5 times the amount of funding that Indian boarding schools got for each student. So because of a lack of money, superintendents overcrowded schools, because if they got more students in, it meant they got more money. And so overcrowding put students in closer contact with each other in dining halls, classrooms, dormitories, etc. Oftentimes, especially in the early period, boarding school students would sleep in the same bed. So tubercular students with non-tubercular students, and diseases would get transferred that way. They shared towels, toothbrushes, combs, clothing, a whole host of objects. And so again, this is why epidemics were so devastating and happened so frequently, is kind of once they got in, they rapidly spread. And this is true today. A couple of years ago, if you look at mumps cases in the United States, 33% of all mumps cases, again, a couple of years ago, but 33% of all mumps cases happened in immigrant detention facilities, which have the same sort of issues, overcrowding, underfunding. And yet those institutions only accounted for 0.2% of the US population. And there's lots of others. Sanitation was really poor in the schools, as I mentioned. Sewer systems, systems weren't, they were plugged. They weren't cleaned out. That's why typhoid fever is such a big deal. So yeah, those are some of the mechanisms that lead to higher disease rates in the schools.
Thank you. Next question we have. Do you have any estimates for the average amount of bias in the ARCIA reports of mortality versus what you've personally found in your archival research?
Yeah, so I mean, these reports, despite their limitations, do have really valuable information in them. And again, often they're kind of the best publicly available reports we have. And there's certain bias. I mean, the Indian office at this time, even just on issues of health, is frequently blaming indigenous bodies for being biologically inferior, et cetera, rather than looking internally and saying, well, maybe it's the conditions of these schools that are actually creating these disease outcomes. But the bias that I typically see in these reports is the underreporting, or they're just not reporting at all. What you'll typically get is just like little snippets of what actually happened. And it's only through kind of those records, the larger boarding school archives, that you get a sense of what was actually happening on a day-to-day, month-to-month, and year level.
Thank you. Okay. And so how about what prompted or inspired your research journey, especially on one such as yours, that deals with like these very heavy topics, child mortality in these federal institutions. What inspired your research journey?
Yeah, so it's childhood. I grew up in kind of a less than functional family with mental health and substance abuse issues. And I was eventually adopted. By the time I got to college, I was really curious about everything. But in particular, I wanted to understand trauma and silences and why, we don't fully understand what our, ancestors went through. And in kind of starting there, I just realized how important research was. My grandfather eventually passed away, and so I didn't find all the answers I was looking for, but I, really quickly came to understand that this work has value for Indigenous people across the country and also the communities that people come from.
Thank you. Okay, Dr. McBride, I think we have time for one more question. So this will be the last question, and it is, what's next for your research, or when you might feel that your research is complete?
This is also a great question. The short answer is, what's next? I'm currently writing a book about all this. But the second question is a little more difficult. What's next? I don't know if I'll ever be done with this project. When Chinita Loma Wema, who wrote, they called it Prairie Light, one of the first books about boarding schools in Chilocco and Oklahoma in particular, I asked her once, did she ever imagine when she published that book, I think in 1994, that she would spend the rest of her career in life working on boarding schools? And her answer is very simply just no. She didn't. And so, yeah, I don't think I'll ever be able to get away from boarding schools, nor do I necessarily want to. But the next step is to write the book.
Well, Dr. McBride, I just want to say on behalf of the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition, we thank you very much for this presentation on behalf of our viewers. It's been an honor to have you speak for our webinar today, so we really appreciate it. Thank you. And
thank you.
Yeah. And I think we're going to go to our final piece, which is our raffle.
Thank you so much, Dr. McBride and Joe. You guys are a great team. I really appreciate all the words that were said. And, and at NABS, we're a organization that loves to give back. And we do appreciate everyone who was able to participate today. And I understand that not a lot of questions were answered. And so we're doing our best to, advocate and get the word and the message out about the work that we're doing, but also about, our bill that's currently in Congress. So this is a call to action. Please talk to your state representatives. We want this commission to happen. We need to have more resources. We need more people on the ground to share this information. And so it's with people like yourselves who are advocating and talking to your relatives and talking to your community is what helps spreads the message and gets the word out. So with that, we really want to thank all of you, and we want to have a raffle. It's, of course, it's not, nothing's ever complete until there's a raffle and there's a giveaway. And so again, we just want to really thank you all for your time. And so we say Wopila Tanka Chichiapi to all of you for joining us. And let's see. Oh, and how you can reach out to us is through our social medias and our website. So please log in and join our membership. Follow us on X, Facebook, and Instagram. We are always advocating and pushing for this bill to be passed. So please join us in our movement. And again, thank you for joining us. Have a good day.
Remember me when the sun comes up in the morning sky. There I will be.